Today's game features Carlsen, Magnus playing as white against Alvarez Calzadilla, Jose Avelino as black. Move 1. White pushes forward to d4. Black knight hops to f6. White responds with pawn to c4. Black pushes the pawn to g6, expanding on the kingside. On move 5, white knight to c3. At this point, advances the pawn to d5. And here, pawn captures pawn. Black knight takes pawn, a sacrifice, creating a solid foundation. White advances the pawn to e4. Black plays knight takes the knight. White pawn strikes, capturing the knight. Black repositions the bishop, establishing a spatial advantage. Meanwhile, slides the queen to a4, putting the king in check. Black maneuvers the knight to d7. On move 15, white develops the knight to f3, developing the minor pieces first. So, tucks the king to safety. White plays bishop to g5. Black now plays pushes to c5. White brings the rook to d1. Black pawn takes pawn. Now, pawn takes pawn. Black places the knight on f6. This improves the position significantly. White repositions the bishop for better activity, neutralizing counterplay. And here, black develops the bishop to g4. We're at move 25. White opts for the short castle. Black bishop trades knight, activating the light-squared bishop. Meanwhile, white takes the bishop with the pawn. Black now plays improves the knight's position. White now plays bishop to e2. Now, bishop to f6. That's a mistake. White deploys the bishop to e3. Black deploys the queen to c8, opening up the position. With time starting to run short, white steps the king to g2, not ideal. Interestingly, pawn moves to e5. We're at move 35. White advances the pawn. Black deploys the queen to d8, coordinating the pieces beautifully. White pawn moves to d6. Black plays repositions the bishop. White moves the king. Black finds a stronger diagonal, improving piece activity. White brings the rook to g1. Black plays deploys the queen to h4. White continues with rook shifts to g2. Moving forward, black cuts off the enemy king with the rook. Move 45. White brings out the queen to b3. Black takes the bishop with the bishop. White pawn takes the bishop. Black rook captures pawn. White rook eliminates the rook. So, repositions the queen to e1, putting the king in check. With less than a minute on the clock, white cuts off the enemy king with the rook. Black boldly takes bishop with the queen. White queen shifts to d1. At this point, black takes the pawn with the queen, centralizing the forces. Feeling the time pressure, on move 55, white slides the rook to e1. Meanwhile, black queen moves to g5. White repositions the rook. Black knight hops to f4. White repositions the rook. Black queen moves to f6. And here, white rook captures the pawn on b7. Black repositions the rook. And here, deploys the rook to d7. Black now plays rook takes the rook. We're at move 65. White takes the rook with the queen. Black brings the knight to e2. At this point, white rook moves behind the passed pawn. Black repositions the knight to f4. With just seconds remaining, white now plays queen removes the pawn. It's black's turn. Slides the queen to g5, a mistake. White responds with slides the queen to f2. At this point, black pushes the passed pawn to h5. Scrambling to find moves. White advances to a4, a solid choice. Black activates the knight, playing on the increment alone. Move 75. White activates the queen in the endgame. Black plays brings the knight to f4, with time running out. White continues with activates the queen in the endgame, keeping an eye on the time. Black slides the queen to f6, coordinating king and pawns. With barely any time left, Interestingly, pawn moves to a5. Black responds with brings out the queen to a6, a questionable choice. Fighting the clock, white plays slides the rook to e1. Not the best move. Black now plays knight jumps to e6. White slides the queen to c3. It's black's turn. Brings the knight closer to the action, creating mating threats. On move 85, white king moves to g2. Black brings out the queen to f6, racing against the clock. Meanwhile, white rook to f1. As time becomes precious. Now, black pushes to h4 in severe time trouble. Interestingly, white king walks to h1, creating zugzwang threats. Black activates the queen in the endgame. White moves the rook to e1. Black king moves to g7, that's a mistake. At this point, white pushes the pawn to f4. Black responds with the pawn marches forward. A questionable choice. With only seconds left on the clock. On move 95, white pawn takes pawn on e5. Interestingly, pawn captures the pawn on e5. With the clock ticking to 0. Next, brings out the queen to c7, discovering check. Continuing, king to h6. Nearly out of time. White queen captures the pawn on e5. Black continues with slides the queen to d3, an inaccuracy. With almost no time remaining. White queen to h8. And that's check. Black activates the king, a candidate move worth considering. On the brink of losing on time. White rook to g1. With check, black king to f4. With the clock about to expire. Move 105. White queen removes the pawn, and check. Forcing a response. Black steps the king to e3, the opposition is key here. In desperate time trouble. White continues with brings the rook to g3, and that's check. The endgame unfolds. Black knight to f3. Playing in extreme time pressure. Now, white rook snaps off the knight, and check. Forcing a response. Alvarez Calzadilla, Jose Avelino resigns. Carlsen, Magnus wins the game.